Fish 28. Sexuality and transvestism. Sex and foreplay. Regarding sex, which is considered to be an extremely vital part of a happy, contented life, by the overwhelming majority of adult humans. Sexual intercourse refers simply to the introduction of a man's penis into a woman's vagina. In respect to sexual activity with another, other forms of sexual gratification are termed foreplay, and all forms of foreplay are not only acceptable within marriage, but are encouraged. Although sex can be a wonderful thing, it is a private matter, and has no place in public forums, apart from a health warning perspective. Lawful sexuality. According to the principle of Dharma, that is, the moral law, as expertly explained within the all-important 12th chapter of this solitary holy scripture, sexual intercourse and foreplay are lawful strictly within the confines of marriage, as defined in the previous chapter, and it has three main purposes, most obviously for having children. As a form of recreation, especially for couples who are unable to afford to partake in costly forms of pleasurable hobbies, due to poverty. And for bringing the couple, or in the case of polygamous marriages, however many are present, closer together. Whenever any one of the procreative, recreative, or unitive aspects of sex is omitted, sex tends to degenerate into a selfish, sinful act. Unlawful sexuality. Some reasons for sexual intercourse being unlawful outside of marriage are as follows. 1. It often results in unwanted progeny. By and large, bastards have been shown to be disadvantaged in every possible way, compared to children born within wedlock, and in virtually every instance, are rife with behavioral problems, especially boys raised by single mothers. 2. It may spread contagious diseases, such as chlamydia, genital herpes, genital warts or human papillomavirus, gonorrhea, hepatitis B, syphilis, trichomoniasis, human immunodeficiency virus, which causes AIDS, as well as other infections that may be sexually transmitted. 3. It contributes to loneliness, particularly in the latter years of life. Sociological studies have demonstrated that, in general, the more sexual partners one has fornicated with, the more challenging it is for a person to commit to a stable, intimate relationship, particularly for women. 4. It can contribute to sexual addiction and objectification. When one is focused solely on gratifying one's own libidinous desires, it is easy to see attractive persons as mere objects, whose only reason for being is to satisfy that lust. All kinds of addiction to pleasure are self-destructive. Homosexuality. Homosexual acts are legitimate solely within polygamous marriages. As explicated in the previous chapter, polygamy is a dharmic, that is, a perfectly legitimate, institution, despite what many deluded, so-called, religious, leaders may claim. Therefore, if a man is engaged in love-making with two or more of his wives, and his wives engage in acts of foreplay with each other, it does not normally cause undue harm to any of the participating parties, nor to society as a whole. Read Chapter 12 and the glossary entry under Slippery Slope, in order to learn the reason for homosexuality being detrimental to society, and therefore, other homosexual acts being unlawful. Whereas heterosexual unions are normal, natural, and necessary for a prosperous society, homosexuality without the confines of marriage is abnormal, unnatural, and unnecessary, and is destructive to individuals, to families, to society, and of course, to the very survival of the Homo sapiens species itself. Leading neuroscientists of the current century, the 21st century, have demonstrated that same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria can be attributed to certain parts of the brain being formed similarly to the person's biological gender opposite. There are other physiological determinants for homosexual attraction, such as genetic and hormonal, and to a far lesser degree, environmental causes. The most common environmental causes are failure to be emotionally attached to one's same-sex parent in early childhood, exposure to pornography, childhood sexual abuse, and in recent times, the promotion, nay, celebration and even glorification of disordered sexuality by the sexual pervert lobby. So, because sexual perversion is rarely punished nowadays, and because most women either divorce their masters or simply fornicate in order to conceive a child, homosexuality and gender dysphoria have been increasing exponentially over the past century or so. As demonstrated in Chapter 11 of this Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity, FISH, the phenomena of homosexual attraction and gender dysphoria was preordained in eternity, but so too were all unbeneficial traits, such as criminality and addictive personality disorders, and it does not negate the obvious requirement for society to punish perpetrators of forbidden homosexual acts. Again, read Chapter 12, in order to understand metaethics, applied ethics, and the reason for same-sex unions being objectively evil, by nature. The argument that criminals ought not be reprimanded for their immoral deeds, due to the non-existence of freedom of volition, is specious, according to the moral law. Of all the concepts put forward in this holiest of all holy scriptures, this condemnation of homosexual acts is, perhaps, the teaching that elicits the most vitriolic responses from individuals, because over the past few decades of the writing this book, homosexuality has become widely accepted within most societies throughout the world, and even celebrated in some cases. However, the obvious fact of its pernicious nature must be proclaimed if human society is to endure and prosper. It ought to be emphasized that homosexual acts themselves are unlawful, and not simply being predisposed to same-sex attraction. In other words, homosexual individuals cannot be prosecuted simply for being attracted to members of the same gender, but only for engaging in unlawful sexual acts, such as sodomy, just as heterosexuals should not be punished merely for being attracted to members of the opposite sex, but for fornicating with them, that is, engaging in extramarital sexual activity. Masturbation. Masturbation is the stimulation of one's own sexual organs, and possibly other erogenous zones, in order to retain pleasure, whether or not climaxing with an orgasm is achieved. As demonstrated in the all-important 12th chapter, there is nothing intrinsically good or bad, for thinking makes it so. Therefore, masturbation can be justified in certain circumstances. Even the Roman Catholic Church, which is known for being rather strict in its teachings concerning marriage and sexuality, gave latitude to masturbatory acts, in its comprehensive catechism, at least before the catechism was hastily revised. Is masturbation a sin? Since a moral act is that deed in which the benefits accrued outweigh the harms caused, if any, it seems to this author that there are a number of situations in which masturbation may be justified. In order to propose two such justifications, a person who has been abandoned by his or her spouse is permitted to gain autoerotic pleasure, at least until she remarries, for it would be unfair to expect that individual to restrain herself for the remainder of her life, simply because she was unfairly deserted by their spouse. Similarly, according to the tenets of Dharma, a bachelor who is unable to find a wife, which, in recent times, is becoming increasingly common, is not only permitted to masturbate, but in fact, urged to practice regular masturbation, lest his voracious libido causes him to seek carnal gratification in far more harmful ways, specifically, by sexually assaulting and/or raping women, girls, or in the case of homosexuals, those of the same sex, gender. It is silly for we spiritual leaders to expect the common folk to have the sexual chastity characteristic of an ascetic, that is, a monk or nun. And even this last sentence is not strictly true, since so-called priests are often guilty of sexual permissiveness, whether privately or publicly. Despite masturbation being a rather ugly and selfish act in itself, I would not hesitate to recommend regular practice of the act to those young men who reside in those countries, nations that prohibit legitimate marriage. As explicated in Chapter 27, a legitimate marriage includes the notion that the husband has absolute authority within his nuclear family. Unfortunately, since about the late 19th century, every jurisdiction on earth has been clamping down, ever more sturdily, on this patriarchal authority, including some nations that are largely Islamic, with Islam being seen as the last bastion of male-dominated societal structures. Thus, it is very dangerous for men to enter into any kind of romantic or intimate relationship with a woman, for to do so leaves the man vulnerable to the whims of his spouse in relation to the so-called police state, as this author knows only too well, after being married twice, and being the victim of more than a couple of false accusations. In case any prudish human considers masturbation to be Adamic, meaning that it results in unjustified harms, the following tract, composed by an anonymous author, may persuade those with a critical mind to reconsider his or her position. The benefits of masturbation. In the case of married persons, 1. One is able to satisfy one's libido at practically any time, without the requirement of a spouse, or in those cases in which one does, in fact, have a spouse, when the spouse is unwilling or unable to engage in sexual activity. Of course, many prudish persons will claim that the most moral course of action would be for one to resist one's urges during these times. Obviously, this is the ideal, but it is hardly practical, since the sex drive, of men, in particular, can be simply too difficult to control, especially in those places where the majority of women dress in a modest attire, as well as the mass media and social media bursting with sexually alluring images. In the case of single men, 2a. It avoids being the subject of false allegations by a spouse, as well as from casual sex partners, which itself is a capital offense. 2b. It avoids divorce, which can ruin the life of a man, especially in the more gynocentric countries, hence the term divorce rape. 2c. It avoids being constantly subject to the belittling, insulting, greedy, conniving, bitchy nature of the typical modern woman. 2d. If masturbation is practiced regularly, and with a proper attitude, it can prevent the man from committing sexual impropriety, especially rape. The disadvantages of masturbation. 1. It may become addictive, especially if masturbation is performed with the aid of pornographic or sexually obscene material. 2. It may disincentivize the search for a spouse. This applies solely in those jurisdictions where marriage is legal, that is to say, in those countries where the government does not persecute husbands who adhere to Dharma, which is virtually none, at present. In order to put it another way, in those nations where men are allowed to govern their families according to the principles of Dharma, cf. Chapter 12, obsessive masturbation may cause men to lose interest in finding a wife, which is a moral imperative for nearly all adult males. TRANSVESTISM. A transvestite is a person who wears clothing belonging to the opposite gender, and is a criminal offense. This truism should not infer that transvestites ought to be severely punished for their choice of attire, but that they must, at least, be sternly admonished by a superior. When males and females dress similarly, including similar hairstyles, it creates an androgynous, or a homogeneous population, thereby reducing the pool of available mates for that proportion of society who are alpha-oriented. For example, a genuinely masculine man, especially an alpha male, would never even dream of mating with a woman who wears male clothing, keeps her hair short in length, and/or behaves as a tomboy. Conversely, transvestinal men and men who conduct themselves in an effeminate manner are utterly unattractive to dainty, feminine women. Transvestism is culturally specific, meaning, in each culture, males and females have the unique, respective fashions. For instance, in Middle East Asia, at least in recent centuries before the modern era, both sexes wear long, one-piece garments, yet there is a distinct color and style differentiation between the robes of each gender. The Indian dhoti and sari are both similar in size and shape, yet worn quite differently and of very different color. At the time of writing, in most countries of the world, males typically wear pants, slacks, jeans, trousers, or short pants, whilst females wear skirts, saris or dresses, at least they should do so, but often do not, due mainly to the influence of feminism. Of course, there may be minor exceptions to this rule, such as monastic robes for Western monks, and Punjabi pants for northwestern Indian women. Yet, even in these last two cases, it could be argued that they are not, in fact, exceptions to the rule, since they adhere to the rule of cultural specificity. Furthermore, both genders must dress modestly in public places, including at swimming pools, at the beach, or bathing in rivers. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Letter to the Hebrews, 13:4. Author indeterminate. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor should a man dress up in women's clothing, for anyone who does this is offensive to the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 22:5. Yahweh, or to be more accurate, whoever authored the Torah.